is Let Me Sum Up, your regular deep dive into recent reports on climate and energy. I'm Luke Menzel, recording on Wurundjeri land, and I'm joined today by my two co-hosts, Global Vice President for pumping out kick-ass T-shirts at the Let Me Sum Up podcast, Frankie Muscovich. Hello, Frankie.
At your service, gents. I want to say promises made, promises kept. Did we actually promise to deliver a T-shirt on energy sovereignty last time we spoke?
I think it was strongly intimated that there would be a T-shirt appearing in our listeners' futures on that topic, yes.
Right. Well, for anyone out there that was like, I don't have the T-shirt to match this global fuel crisis, you don't have to worry anymore. One kind of consumption.
Does it come in oil?
One kind of consumption is definitely not in danger of being cut off, and that is the bespoke T-shirt on-demand printing service that LMSU has got you covered for.
A fuel crisis compounded by a fashion crisis would have been unendurable, but that fate has been averted.
Thank goodness.
Frankie, what does it say on the front of this T-shirt?
Well, following a period of frenzied consulting, which is, our little version of our own national cabinet going on over the last weekend or whatever it was, we've got a somewhat familiar looking slogan. If you're familiar with our More Sufficiency Now T-shirt, you can now get a T-shirt that looks remarkably similar on the front that says Energy Sovereignty Now with a big exclamation mark. And then on the back, because I think we each individually thought about this for maybe a couple of hours and decided if we just left it there, maybe people would take away, their takeaway would be I don't know, we could turn around and you could just as easily see drill, baby, drill on the back of it or something. But instead we've chosen to be rather specific about the kind of energy sovereignty now that the LMSU podcast is speaking, and that is efficiency, electrification, renewables. So that's on the back.
Yay.
Yeah, it's great. Go there immediately. Run, don't walk. Let me sum up merch. I'm kind of I'm semi curious to know how this particular T-shirt fares next to the Sufficiency Now T-shirt, which I remain loyally committed to. It's my favorite T-shirt of all time. So, buy some, but don't buy that many because...
What? Hang on. Don't buy that many. That's your message as VP of Marketing and Extortion.
I've done enough extorting of my children over the Easter weekend when it comes to various shapes of foiled chocolate bunnies and such. So I'm feeling a little generous tonight with our dear listeners. I'm going to give them a break.
I encourage you to ignore Frankie's advice and buy all the T-shirts. So you should visit letmesumup.net. You can find the merch tab at the top of the page and you'll find our store, which has T-shirts and mugs and tote bags and anything else. I don't think there's anything else. That's what it's called, right?
I'm pretty sure that's it. Although it's coming up to winter and I think we had talked about hoodies. So maybe that'll be the next cab off the rank, unless this fuel crisis keeps going and the inspiration is plentiful. We might have to come up with more variants.
As Frankie says, run, don't walk. We're also joined by a man who recently put his player character on the line as part of a noble defence of colonial Victoria against an invasion from Tsarist Russia. It is Tennant Reid. Good day, Tennant.
Hello. Yes, I did take part in the Battle of Hastings. Hastings in Western Port Bay, 1890, in which the Princess Bride quote of "You are attempting to kidnap what we have rightfully stolen" has never been more relevant. And that was but one of the absurd situations I found myself in. I think the highlight might have been the Australian soapy emulator role-playing game in which I was attempting to thwart the kidnapping of the beloved town publican by mafia hoodlums while role-playing Skippy the Bush Kangaroo, which did mean that I was not able to speak during my role-playing, only make noises and gesturing in meaningful ways. A good time was had by all.
And I suppose we should explain that this was all taking place in the context of the Conquest Gaming Convention that took place in Melbourne this Easter weekend.
Yes, I suppose that does put all these insane remarks in some kind of explicable framework, doesn't it?
You can try, guys, but you're failing dismally.
All right, we better get down to it then. On this week's show, we look at a new bit of analysis from IEEFA that catalogues each and every lever Australia could potentially pull to get us through the current global energy crisis. But first, it's the global energy crisis. Yes, the crisis is on. But the good news is that since we last recorded, National Cabinet has met and agreed to a national fuel security plan. And while this document serves to get state and federal governments broadly on the same page and sets out 4 levels of collective response, governments are retaining a lot of flexibility on when further interventions might be triggered. Right, Frankie?
That is right. I think this, so the National Fuel Security Plan, I think we who think about energy and climate policy all day long, every day as part of our jobs, don't think about how the broader public, might need to be receiving information from decision makers about situations like this, and, who aren't paying attention to the ins and outs of the minutiae of what goes through the Strait of Hormuz and exactly how does that impact us at the end of contorted supply chains. So, I'm sort of viewing this as a useful kind of piece of messaging. It's a 4-point plan, and I think, the National Cabinet's attached a range of options to each of those steps. The first one is plan and prepare, but that's basically BAU. Everything is, as usual. You don't have to, do anything different when you're purchasing fuel, just a kind of standard BAU setting. We are currently at level 2, which is keep Australia moving. And I think that's where we started to see some more nuanced, language started to be introduced, probably typified by the PM's national address, which I want to circle back to if we can. So the key messages, at this stage of things, and, these are things you're hearing from every government spokesperson as you're going about your business when they're being interviewed. So it's, only take as much fuel as you need. So, make prudent and considered choices. You started to see the PM say, if you can take the train to work, you should do that. Or if it's okay with your employer to work from home, you could do that too. So there's a lot of voluntary action started to be introduced, but not a huge amount of urgency, I'd say, attached to some of that.
And I think the thing that I've noticed that has shifted in the last week or two is there's less, appeal to just a broader sense of the common good and more sort of storytelling about the kinds of people and businesses that don't have the flexibility to use less fuel. The shout outs to the tradies and the farmers and shift workers that just need to get to work and don't have much choice about doing it. I think just trying to ground that call to action in a sense of common cause across the community and doing it in a much more explicit way. You can see them really starting to think about how they make sure this message lands in the community in the context of voluntary action. Nobody's being forced to do anything, but they're wanting to give people a strong sort of emotionally resonant reason to do things a little bit differently.
Yeah. I mean, it had a lot of echoes of COVID for me in some ways, where, you know, like I think the PM's wanting to invoke like that and just sort of reintroduce that real sense of community. Like, you know, when in that time of adversity, you know, you did see kind of people take more extraordinary action to help out their neighbours, you know, the people that lived around them. I think, you know, you can see that he's starting to want to introduce that kind of thinking in the broader population. So, you know, like if you, white collar worker, can take the train, well, that's really going to help out, you know, these tradies or, you know, or farmers out in more rural areas where being at the end of a supply chain, fuel can, you know, is starting to become a little trickier in some places. So they're wanting to start people thinking about, if it's not a problem for you in your life right now, to think about the broader impact and make considered choices. I mean, that also goes to also this messaging being very kind of, you know, calm, considered, and, you know, encouraging people to also think in that way is to stop people hoarding, basically, and going out there and panic buying and buying a bunch of jerry cans and filling them up. So he's really trying to counteract some of that activity which has been happening over the past few weeks, as people, you know, are understandably wanting to shore up their own situation. So, I mean, what else is happening, you know, at the current state of level 2, we've seen the government relax some of their fuel standards so that slightly less clean fuel has been allowed to be used in cars over the last little while. And that's meant to have, you know, freed up a little bit of extra capacity. Government is also, you know, more actively involved in shoring up cargoes. Like we did see a little bit of supply on the way into Australia drop off, but then, you know, alternatives were sourced. So government's getting very active there. And they're also managing that minimum stock holding obligation as well.
And so where we stand at the moment that we record, Energy Minister Chris Bowen was out earlier today saying a normal level of inward cargoes of refined products and oil has been secured through to the end of April and into the start of May. And it's, you know, it's not clear if that can continue at full or past that point. It is, I suppose, possible that Australia can secure a 100% continuation of normal import levels by just buying our way to that goal amidst rising global prices. But we might well see, in fact, a reduced level of inflows. But we do have these stock holdings onshore of refined products, and that's about a month's worth. And so that can ease if we're deploying it. And of course, you do want to think carefully about how much of your emergency reserve you do meet out. That will soften things. It's still plausible that from May-ish, we start heading into the later stages of the plan. And what do those have in them, Frankie?
Yes, well, but just before we move off, the other thing that's been interesting to watch, and this goes to, you know, the fact that we are, as we've observed in the last couple of pods that we've been talking about this, heavily reliant on imported fuel when it comes to diesel, petrol, etc. But we are a huge exporter of LNG, and that's, you know, the other commodity that is, you know, very tightly constrained and subject to the same kind of impacts with what's going on in Iran. So what the government's been doing, understandably, is leveraging our capacity as an LNG exporter to strike some more bilateral deals with key trade partners in the region that we rely on heavily for imports of those fuels, but we export LNG to them. So I think Singapore was an example of that I think, in the last week or so. And, maybe we'll expect to see a little bit more of that. But the government has been acting to say, well, we'll keep the gas, coming to you if you make sure, the fuel is coming to us. So they've been taking action like that too. It all starts to get a little bit more serious, though, when we get to levels 3 and 4. 3 being take targeted action. So not alarmist language at all.
That sounds perfectly fine.
You can just imagine the workshopping that went into the naming of these different levels. So what does this mean? This means bigger steps from government to act to secure supply. So that will mean actions needed to be taken to conserve fuel, and those would be decisions taken in consultation with National Cabinet when it comes to what might need to be done at a state and territory level as well. So demand side measures. And again, they're not being super specific about exactly what those things might be on purpose, I would imagine.
You'd guess that some of those would be items on the list of International Energy Agency suggestions that we covered last time. Things like lowering freeway speeds a bit, for example. Yeah. Which would be relatively simple. And as my partner said the other day, people, regular users of Melbourne's Eastern Freeway might not even notice the difference.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So I think you're likely to see, and I think it's not a mistake that you saw the PM in his address introduce things like, if you can work from home and that's okay for your circumstances, your employer, it would be good if you did that. Taking the train, also a good idea. I think those two things are things that people got used to doing through COVID, where that was possible, if you could do your work that way. And so I'd expect stronger messaging and action along those lines, and maybe even, and this is where state and territory government action is really significant as well, because they may want to incentivise for example, more travel on public transport by making it free or dropping the price of tickets and things like that. Even though you could be almost certain not many state and territory governments would be interested in giving free public transport to people who have been spending a bunch of money on infrastructure over the last few years.
Well, Tennant and I are already the beneficiaries of the prompt action of the Victorian government on this front. I believe the Tasmanian government's already acted as well. And so, interesting that New South Wales response. I heard the New South Wales Treasurer suggesting that they need to keep their powder dry.
Yeah, I mean, we've got this beautiful shiny metro, and I think they're interested in getting people to continue paying for that as long as they deem it feasible, I guess. Yeah, but, I think we're just not at the stage yet. I think there's already very good take-up of that. So, we'll have to see how things progress, I guess. The other sort of thing, which we haven't touched on, but, really what's intimated in that level 3 is, stepped-up action from government to secure supply. And that means almost certainly working in with those key trade partners to shore up what can be shored up. The other thing which is interesting, I think, in terms of some of those other actions, did kind of nod at increased efficiency of trucking and stuff like that. So longer hours and things like that as well. Level 4 though is where, it's pretty serious, and that is called protecting critical services for all Australians. So that does involve a level of forced rationing to keep and direct fuel for critical purposes.
And the language there, I think, is quite carefully chosen as well, because in rationing circumstances, I think there'll be a tendency for people to feel like, well, why are they getting something and I'm not? And the message here is the things that will be prioritized for fuel are things that everybody needs to remain available. So I think the list is not going to wind up looking exactly like the on-the-shelf 2016 draft of a retail fuel rationing system, but some of the things in that list you'd have to imagine will remain in whatever a new list is: emergency services, police, public transport system, a lot of buses that need diesel, that sort of thing, which is benefits a lot of people in fundamentally important ways.
Yeah. I mean, the only kind of level of specifics the plan actually goes into calls up things like life-supporting services, utilities, or emergency services. I think the sort of obvious question marks kind of beyond that are raised are like, well, how would this apply to farmers in rural, communities that need diesel to power equipment. And I know that that's a particular concern at the moment because we're about to go into a planting season, and so there's going to be a lot of activity happening around the country on that front given the season. So these things are top of mind. And I think the other thing that's also worth noting is that there's a giant fat disclaimer at the bottom of this plan that says levels 3 and 4 are under consideration and might change depending on the circumstances. So they really are giving themselves a fair bit of latitude to change that as they need to.
And I personally, I think that's appropriate. I think that's understandable. But it's a funny sort of plan where you don't discover its existence or even write it until you're at step 2 of it.
Yep.
And then steps 3 and 4 are, we'll make that we'll get a little more definite about that later.
But that tells you everything though, right? Doesn't it? It tells you that the government needed a device or something to point to let people know, a 4-step thing is an easy thing to conceptualize, and you don't even really need to know what's in it. If you're at level 2 and there's 4, it ain't too bad.
I think that's exactly right.
Yeah.
I think as much as anything else, the vast majority of Australians will have no idea what is in the steps 1, 2, 3 or 4. But the fact that it's an anchoring device, it's this is how serious it is now. There's a couple more gradations of seriousness that we could potentially get to. We're not there yet. And so it's as much as anything else a storytelling device. I mean, we are the podcast which, finds plans and complains that they're not plans. They're actually something else. I think that it would be fair to say this is not really a plan. It's more of a framework at best. But I'd suggest that's probably what was called for at this particular moment. I am interested in some of the wording that is in that level 4, the reference to critical sectors in particular. And yes, we're all having COVID PTSD on all kinds of fronts. They're kind of bun fights of, which sectors were important to keep on the road and keep active in the context of the global pandemic. If we get anywhere near that level 4, you can expect all that jockeying to start again, because there'll be, emergency services. There's no debate over that, but you can imagine concentric circles of sectors that sort of emanate out from that, where it becomes quite contested, and there are trade-offs that need to be made. And the wording that I found particularly interesting was the idea that there would be a nationally consistent framework for the prioritisation of fuel supplies to critical sectors.
A fine aspiration.
Yeah.
It
really is. That could be a hard thing to achieve.
And some of those decisions will be well, no, actually all of those decisions will be really fraught. So obvious inclusion and inclusion in the draft from 2016 is ambulances are a critical use an essential use. Okay, I think everybody agrees that. What about nurses needing to get to work? You could make a case that, yes, they need that. You could make the case that, well, there's greater potential for nurses to take the bus or the train, or that's very contextual. And that's not an easy call.
What have you got against our hardworking nurses, Janet?
Nothing at all. But if we need to find a spare 20% out of everything, that's the kind of really annoying judgment that people would have to argue about and hopefully get to a consistent view on.
And the tendency will be to think about what was prioritised during COVID, but COVID was a health crisis.
Yep.
And there were very, very good reasons to prioritise the needs of our first responders, because they were literally at the front line of that crisis, and obviously continue to be essential to so many of us in our daily lives. But this isn't a crisis centered around, an epidemic. It's different. So I think that's quite a complex kind of thing to navigate as well. And yeah, they had to jump on the national cabinet of it all, didn't they? Because could you imagine 8 premiers just sitting down and deciding individually which industries they were each going to prioritise anyway, horrific.
Yes.
And let's hope we don't find ourselves in that situation. But more or less, I think you can, when you see this laid out and you look at, the things like the PM's address, which, I think people got really worked up, like I certainly did. I think I was in Canberra the day that happened, and there was a bit of a buzz around national address. Haven't had one of those in a while.
I don't know what I was doing that day, but I was obviously focused on something else, and so I completely missed the fact that this national address had been mooted, that it was coming this evening. So my main experience of the national address was listening to people on podcasts complaining that it wasn't all of that much and that they'd been promised this amazing national address.
It was quite short.
It was quite short.
In terms of theatre criticism, of the national addresses by national leaders that took place in the course of that week, I would mark this one up for brevity and for not issuing bizarre threats to anybody.
That's true. That's a pretty low bar there, Tennant, though.
It was calming, but it had some bits of useful information in it, and it established there are going to be some of these addresses as needed, and stay tuned.
Yeah.
And that's okay. And especially as in the process of doing those important but limited things, it did not actually take up much of people's time.
I agree. I think probably the reason for doing it was to have the first one. And so you're creating an expectation that this is, we're in a serious situation and you might be hearing more from me like this in the next little while. But as regards the actual message delivered, I think what they will have been thinking in the lead up to Easter weekend, when a lot of people, either have made plans to travel with their families or whatever, there might have been a little bit of a freak out going, oh my God, what if people go out with jerry cans on their, I don't know. I don't know. But I literally think this was the most boring message you could hope to deliver in advance of what's usually a really busy period of activity where people aren't paying attention to, politicians and stuff. They're spending time with their loved ones and enjoying a long weekend. And I think they wanted to avert any, just really kind of put a damper you don't need to buy like more fuel than you need, and just sort of reinforce that message. But I think my favourite summary of that was like a really good Batuta that I saw pop up in my Insta. It was just like, could have been an email, which I thought was very accurate. But anyway, I understand why they're doing it. What do you reckon? Are we done with this? Should we talk about other things that the government's done in and around this?
I feel like we can't let this topic go without addressing the cut in the fuel excise that took place since we last recorded, which I think was becoming politically necessary to do something to ease the severe cost of living pressures that punters were having out there.
Yeah.
But then it spurred, various debates, the hairs running in a variety of directions in the commentariat going, is this inflationary? Is this exacerbating supply-demand imbalances because we're making fuel cheaper when there should be that price incentive to moderate demand? I don't know. What did you guys make of all of that?
So I think that for the circumstances that we're in at this moment, where there is currently no supply shortfall in Australia, there's just a price reaction due to a demand reaction. This does serve an immediate cost of living, and of course there was also a cut in the a zeroing out for the time being of the heavy vehicle road user charge for the same 3-month period. It serves a cost relief function. It does reduce the price incentive to save fuel during that period, but it hardly eliminates it. And it serves a political function of the government is doing something, and people aren't alone. Whenever we hit, and for however long we hit, the supply shortage period, this may still serve a political function, but it won't actually serve any affordability function because the price of fuel will rise to whatever level it has to kill enough demand to balance supply and demand. And it will make no difference during that period, whenever it happens, to affordability, whether that final excruciatingly high price that we see at the Bowser includes an element of tax or no element of tax. So it will ultimately, if sustained, be an expensive way to send a message, but it may be an important message.
I viewed this as an almost entirely political decision. I think, and I don't disagree with any of the points that you're raising there. I mean, I think the fact that this has been done on just for 3 months tells you they really hope this whole thing is resolved by then. It's going to be very hard to, if we're still kind of where we are like now, in 3 months, to put it back up at that time. That almost certainly will be a deeply unpopular thing. But I also think the alternative was for the government to spend the next month in the lead up to the budget being hammered by the opposition saying you're not doing anything to help people with the cost of living, and they would have just got slammed over and over again. So I don't know, maybe I'm just a little cynical, but this just looks like a move to cut the opposition off at their knees and remove that particular argument. Because as Tennant says, prices could still go up, and not disagreeing that this is and will be welcome relief for people, but it's not really sending the right signals when it comes to changing people's behaviour. So there could have been other things you could have done with the $3 billion this is going to cost as well.
And I guess the other big development was the move to give Export Finance Australia the power to underwrite the purchase of fuel. the private sector coming to the government and saying, well, you know, fuel's pretty expensive out there, takes a while to get here. If the crisis blows over and, you know, prices drop, we're going to be on the hook for potentially tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions, if you know, times all those cargo ships together, and not being able to recoup those costs. And so the government has agreed to share some of that risk, which presumably is going to make it a lot easier for those commercial entities to make the call and say, yes, we're going to go and source more expensive fuel from other places in the knowledge that, you know, we're not going to take a bath on it if things calm. I think in the world of potential scenarios the government could experience over the coming months, the one in which they're on the hook for helping out those companies because the crisis has blown over and prices have dropped precipitously is one they could live with, I reckon.
Yeah, I think that's right.
That feels like a bit of a no regrets action.
And in the longer term, those changes could turn out to be quite significant for another element of public policy, which is the idea of building up strategic reserves of a range of products and materials, including the government highlights critical minerals and you know, there have been a lot of ideas out there for stabilising not just the supply but also the price of rare earths and other things that people worry about. And the disruptions that people have in mind there are not just shortfalls of those things, but also occasional gluts of those things. Successive efforts to diversify is the low stress language of, but like build up non-Chinese supply of rare earths in particular have been frustrated by the periodic opening of the floodgates of Chinese supply, arguably to flush out attempts to diversify those supply chains. So we'll see, but the broader idea of having more cards up your sleeve in the event of disruptions to global freely traded supplies of different products, we're going to see a lot of that. And is it going to be a good idea for everything? Are the forms in which it's pursued going to be effective? Like that stuff will need scrutiny. But the basic case for its relevance is a lot stronger than it appeared to be to old line, let the market decide neoliberals like me, or me of some years back.
It's your fault, Tennant. I knew it. Shall we chat about a report?
Change of pace time.
Not that much.
The Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis, or IEEFA, were quick off the mark in response to the current energy crisis with a new briefing note titled The Perfect Storm to Boost Energy Security: How Australia Can Reduce Its Oil Exposure in the Wake of the Iran Conflict. In it, they provide some helpful context on Australia's exposure to global liquid fuel supply chains and how that has evolved over time. They then turn to the actions that governments can take to respond, both to ameliorate the immediate crisis and to reduce our exposure to this sort of shock in the longer term. Tennant, this briefing note is short, sharp, and pretty helpful, right?
Yeah, this is a good way to organise our thinking about like how we got here, where we are, what the different forms of option are to respond to it, and offer some ideas on which ones we should be broadly looking at the genre of. It's a jumping off point. It's not a definitive final answer to much of this, but it is very useful in that context. One of the things that it highlights is that we have been heading towards our present level of vulnerability for a while, that 25 years ago, Australia was almost completely insulated from the supply shortage risk part of a crisis like this one. We had a significant amount of domestic oil production relative to oil consumption and a large amount of onshore refining capacity. And that, like both parts of that, dribbled away over those 2 decades to the point where during the last few years, including the pandemic years, where there was a lot of stress on refineries and oil production globally because of a lack of demand. It was the opposite to the current crisis. We fell down to just a couple of remaining refineries, supplying only about 20% of the local demand and using 80% imported product. So from where we are, what could we do to adjust? And IEEFA survey options on the supply side and the demand side. They have a decent amount to say about something we referenced earlier in this episode, which is the potential for or the pursuit of deals by Australia as a major gas supplier through LNG with the economies that are, for us, the most significant suppliers of refined fuel products, including Korea and China and Japan. And these gas for oil deals, they think might be a promising way to soften the blow to Australian supply. A lot of other supply options, they're pretty dismissive of the potential to up domestic supply of oil, and increasing refining capacity doesn't make a lot of sense if you're not producing the oil to refine domestically. They do think that it's quite promising. No surprise here, but I think they make a decent, if brief, case for it, promising to look at a lot of options for electrification and the increased production of onshore renewable electricity to back that in. I think that we could have some useful arguments about some of those judgments, if for nothing else than to sort of strengthen the conviction that those judgments are right. But then the task is to flesh out the doing bit, because there would be quite a lot involved in substantially boosting the level of electrification beyond what price response and what I expect to be the long memory of these still very much unfolding events will do to the long-term uptake of particularly electric vehicles. So I thought this was very useful, but what did you two think?
I just thought it was super helpful as a paper that was kind of like a little bit of a cook's tour of all the issues and some of the history in terms of liquid fuel supplies. I thought it did some of the things we wished the IE paper perhaps lent into a little bit more in terms of both looking at some of the levers that we can pull to deal with the acute and immediate crisis, as well as kind of flagging some of the sensible areas of policy that can increase our resilience to future crises. The discussion in the paper around the opportunity for those bilateral deals is one of the areas that I found most interesting, and is kind of something worth unpacking around the degree to which those deals are likely to come off, the degree to which the supply chains actually line up well in terms of places that we're exporting LNG to and that we're expecting liquid fuels to be arriving in Australia from, and just the willingness of the government to actually credibly pulled that lever and actually cut off the LNG, there's obviously a lot of goodwill and deep partnerships with a number of the countries that are referenced here. So, on that basis, there could be a sense of fellow feeling and cause, and maybe that's enough to get you part of the way. But if the premise of the case is, well, we're going to cut you off if you don't send us the good stuff, well, that's got to be a credible threat. And I'm interested in both of your thoughts as to whether it actually is a credible threat.
So I've spoken to a friend of the podcast who shall remain nameless, but a long and close observer of Australian national energy policy, who did not believe that threat was fundamentally credible at all. And we have had so there's a lot of committed contracted LNG exports, and then there's uncontracted exports on top of that. We have had a sacrosanct status on the contracted exports at Australian policy debates for years, and most recently in December when the federal government committed to a domestic gas reservation. They again underlined that there will be no interference through that process with the existing foundation contracts for the East Coast LNG exporters. And are we going to block that gas? Probably not. We wouldn't do it in peacetime, and in wartime. Yes, the wartime for others, we're officially not at war. The consequences for our trade partners of cutting off those exports are quite large.
Many of these countries use LNG for power generation.
Yes, and outside of this next bit is not so much, to my knowledge, currently the issue in Japan, China and Korea, but in India, a large proportion of the nation's fertilizer production plants are operating at part capacity because of the reduction in inflows of LNG. And that has obviously got severe human consequences in the medium term. And so in that world, are we really going to say we will cut off anybody in the short term if we don't get the diesel and the petrol that we want? I think things would have to get really bad before Australia would actually go all the way on that, if just the peace and comedy and fellow feeling of, hey, we've got mutually beneficial exchange and everything's wonderful, doesn't prove to be quite enough amidst a global reduction. And I should say a global reduction of oil supply of in the region of 20 to 25%, a global reduction in gas supply of about 3%. LNG supply much more affected, those LNG-dependent economies much more affected, but are more easily compensated for reduction overall. So, I think this one's hard, but what do you reckon, Frankie?
I wouldn't see them pulling that lever unless it was truly desperate times. And really for all the reasons you said, we've been so steadfast through a lot of tetchy debates around what to do with gas exports, and have just held up the sort of contracted gases. We will never touch that. We are a reliable trade partner. I think there would be, understandably, there would be deep reservations about doing that because of the flow-on consequence that would come from that in future. Presumably, we are going to continue trading with these countries, and the shape of that trading partnership will hopefully change in the future, away from fossil gas and, potentially to other things. We're having conversations around green commodity exports and things like that. I think the desire to hold sort of true to our reputation as being a reliable partner would prevail in almost every situation. I mean, I think the thing that this paper really does highlight, it really kind of smacks you in the face in the way that the government would clearly not have wanted to emphasise in a lot of its messaging, is that we are really much more exposed than a lot of other countries to an acute crisis. Like that we, you know, of IEA countries in particular, we've got by some margin the lowest sort of stock of reserves. And I think for obvious reasons, the government won't have wanted to emphasise that, even though that's been, you know, happening for a long period of time, kind of gradually. We are, in a way, like rather uniquely exposed to a crisis like this compared to those peer countries. So I wonder if that changes the calculus on any of this.
And I think that exposure, like the building up of that exposure has not gone uncommented on, but it did just keep happening. And I wonder if like a combination of just enough knowledge to be dangerous and a failure of imagination was part of that. I can recall in my day job getting in a little trouble a few years ago with some public commentary to the effect that Australia basically had no effective fuel security, and this was one of the reasons why we should be interested in expanding our use of electric vehicles. And the pushback from some people in the fuel supply industry was like, oh, this is a very unhelpful thing to say. And look, yes, we're all in on the freedom of the seas and like interruption of shipments of fuel to Australia would mean we were cooked. But actually we have an incredibly vast coastline and it would be incredibly hard and implausible to interdict Australia. And like, you know, don't scare the horses because it's not going to happen. And that was as far as it went, like, correct. I mean, it's still true. It would be incredibly hard to specifically interdict Australia. The failure of imagination was, what if the world is being interdicted? Because the freedom of the seas, backed by the world's law-abiding hyperpower, ain't what it used to be, and looks more of a passing thing all the time. So yeah, we have got ourselves into a highly vulnerable place with everybody's fingerprints sort of on the various actions and omissions that led us there. And we do have to dig our way out of that now, including because it's very hard to believe that the current crisis is going to be like definitively, permanently over in a way that there couldn't just be a restart to interruptions in the Strait of Hormuz the next time that somebody decides to mow the lawn on Iran and Iran decides to reestablish its credibility and retaliate.
I do wonder, just sort of considering all of this, like, you know, there is a question about whether and how much focus, meaningful focus, this has been given by governments over the last little while. Like, I think, you know, the decision point, if there were, because there were, you know, there have been repeated warnings in various kind of security assessments on this, but, you know, the thing hasn't been on fire. And it's expensive. I mean, like, yes, you know, just the obvious thing, which we, you know, should emphasize in all of this is that, and the good folks at IEEFA, you know, point this out, to increase, you know, domestic supply or increase stockpiles, it doesn't come cheap, and it wouldn't be immediate either. We're in this kind of conundrum where we're uniquely exposed to course correct and kind of, you know, I don't know, get us up to the level of kind of national storage that we've notionally signed up to as a member of the IEA would cost billions and billions of dollars.
Well, the figure that's regularly quoted is that to get up from around the 30-odd days that we're at now to the IEA recommended 90 days is going to cost you in the order of $20 billion. And no government or opposition, except for the Bill Shorten-led opposition in the 2019 election, has been particularly excited by that prospect. I think this is a bit of a menu of options, right? Some of them IEEFA likes a little bit more than others. I think it does a reasonable job at arguing that, we're unlikely to be able to cost effectively secure local supplies of traditional fossil liquid fuels in an Australian context. Maybe we can access some of them. They're likely to be very expensive. That could be quite cost ineffective way of achieving the fuel security that we're all now so interested in. But within the menu, like increasing stockpiles probably makes a bit of sense. We're going to have an economy that is pretty reliant on fossil liquid fuels, at least in the short to medium term, and you need to deal with that reality while accelerating your efforts to do the sensible things that wean us off those supply chains. And, in IEEFA's view, and I think it's, there's a good case for it, like electrification, and they call out in particular transport, but also mining. And the reliance of the mining sector on diesel is a significant issue in this context. Really interesting to reflect on the degree to which this current crisis takes the prospect of electrification of some of these sectors, which, is not a new idea. It's something that is canvassed pretty widely in the sector plans that were released last year, and we worked our way through on this podcast. Takes it from something which is the preserve of, climate policy, folks that are thinking about that long-term transition of the economy and maybe not getting as much attention or focus from the sectors that are often talked about, whether they're freight and logistics or mining and resources, to actually having more willing partners for the government saying, okay, we are now interested in this agenda and interested in the policy that would help us accelerate this transition, because it is we can see that, as well as the broader benefits in terms of climate transition and economic transition, this is actually dealing with a clear and present danger that we see in terms of the resilience of our own business.
I mean, this is a twisted bowl of spaghetti if I think about the different dynamics playing out, because, until there was a global fuel crisis upon us all, there was a live conversation starting to be had about winding back the diesel fuel tax credit for large mining companies, right? And so, and sort of proponents for reform in that space have been making the case. And, this is also connected to things like the Safeguard Review. There has not been a high enough price on carbon emissions in parts of the economy for heavy emitters to force the investment in on-site decarbonisation of things like that. It's not as though the technology doesn't exist, for these applications. So we're in this situation where that was a live discussion or consideration not too long ago. We've also just blown a $3 billion hole in the budget with a cut to fuel excise, and that was already looking like a pretty close run thing. I think no one is expecting anything in a way of spending measures this federal budget. So you'd have to think that actually some of the logic for re-gearing, a diesel fuel tax credit to use it or lose it electrification incentive makes a hell of a lot of sense in this context for companies who can afford to take the step and make the investment. So I find myself wondering whether feels like a bit of whiplash. Is it on? Is it off? Like, when is the right time for, for decisive reform?
And I think there's those domestic considerations of part of all of this, but there's also like the global context, right? Because for a lot of the equipment and vehicles that we're looking to access, these are going to be questions that are being grappled with by these companies right around the world. Mm-hmm. And, to the degree that, demand increases for this sort of equipment, prices come down for this sort of equipment, there could be like a more of an ecosystem impact, that there's just more and better equipment that's available that can be dropped into an Australian context. Now, that's not going to happen in the next 6 to 12 months, but we could see quite a profound shift in the trajectory of investment decisions and availability of electrified, large, heavy freight and heavy vehicles that are used in a resources context, which could be more consequential than anything that we attempt to do from a policy perspective in Australia.
Yeah, and I think it's worth thinking about one important variable between the various options that IEEFA lay out. There's a bunch of electrification that they canvass. They're also thinking about biofuels and maybe synthetic fuels, including like hydrogen or ammonia, but also ideas for, and I think we've heard others more positively mention ideas for building up a coal to liquids industry in Australia, which would strike some people as a terrible idea.
I wish this was a video podcast so that our listeners could see the look that just went across Frankie Muscovich's face.
It wasn't a welcoming look.
Thank you for clarifying. Lest there be some confusion out there in this listener land. Yes.
On that point, China has spent the last several years building up a significant coal to chemicals industry, which is, for the time being, looking like a really strategic thing to make them less vulnerable. But the thing that is a characteristic that is different between most, I think, of the electrification options and most, maybe all, of the alternative molecules options is that as and when the prices of conventional oil-based fuels and petrochemicals somewhat drop, they're not going to be at current levels forever. There may well be an enduring risk premium or even tolling premium from Iran just controlling the strait and levying a bit off the top for good. But when prices are not at current crisis levels, electrification will still pencil out. It was financially attractive in February to electrify light vehicles in most contexts. If you had, the money to buy a new car of any sort, and it was a good time for you to do so, it would be worth your while to electrify. And that was starting to be the case for important niches of freight as well. And that's only going to get more true with the dynamics that Luke was talking about. But it may not be true that your biofuels project still pencils out if the post-crisis policy environment and market structure and willingness to pay of buyers of fuel is like what it was beforehand. Now, if companies that use a lot of fuel are willing actually to have a long memory and pay over the odds for something that is more secure or differently secure to conventional fuel pathways, then projects to make biofuels or coal to liquids or whatever might have a Guernsey. We have seen in the past, in the very recent past, with all the disruptions to Chinese supply chains that came through the course of the pandemic, that China plus one or diversify away from China proved to be a hard thing to stick to for a lot of businesses because the short-term cost optimization was still quite attractive. And so there will have to be, I think, active government support of some sort for any of the non-electrification pathways, which we may well need somewhat. Like certainly I think a lot of people would say some bio-based inputs of some sort will be needed. They're going to need something to sustain them when, oil is not at $100 plus per barrel.
Yeah. And we don't, like, the policy architecture isn't fleshed out here in Australia for this, right? Like, I mean, we've just been sort of reflecting on that. Like, there was a 1.1 billion with the launch of the net zero plan for production tax credits, but there aren't the demand side kind of signals yet in place. And, SAF has been highlighted as, an obvious, potential first cab off the rank. Tricky.
Sustainable aviation fuel.
Thanks, Mr. Reid. But, I think here's where, the traditional approach that you take from a policy setting, sort of sense there would be you introduce a mandate of some kind, but that would normally flow through to a small increase in what people would be paying in their airfares, which at this moment in time you could understand, wouldn't be preferable. And anyway, you could see where the hesitation might come from. All of that said, though, I think it'd be, I just sort of need to say the thing, like we lived through COVID under a government that tried to message around a gas-fired recovery, which was not a thing anyway, as far as I could tell or care to try and remember or resurrect memories of from that time. It would be such a huge wasted opportunity not to bet on electrification and doubling down our efforts and sort of bringing hopefully some real innovation to other policies we might throw at this in the next little while to speed the uptake in areas where it certainly does already make sense, and maybe we can nudge those areas, particularly sort of like commercial vehicles, to really kind of put a rocket under it. And so things that come to mind are, and I agree, people have various views about the EV tax incentive at the moment. It's expensive. It's been wildly popular, though. And
you'd have to imagine it's only getting more wildly popular as we speak.
You would say so. And I think from a sort of fiscal management perspective, of course, I think the government would be, and they have been reviewing it, right, would have been thinking about winding that down. But at this point in time, you'd have to think that sending the opposite signal we want to be sending out there. So I do wonder, what else can be done? What else can be done to incentivize uptake? State and territory governments are getting pretty light off in this debate, I'd say, so far. There are things that can be done there around stamp duties and rego fees and, things that are meaningful in terms of incentives or discounts that might be applied. I hope this workshopping is happening in the background somewhere, because this is a chance to engineer a real kind of structured and long-term pivot and do it in a really intentional way, rather than just piggybacking off the ecosystem, of change that might be coming from other countries. I don't want to waste the moment.
Yeah. I think that I come back to something that we touched on last time, which was kind of like the the response to the immediate crisis and the kind of how you set up sensible policies to make sure that we don't find ourselves here again. I know there's been a lot of public servants scrambled. We've got, fuel coordinators appointed in every state and territory and at the national level, dealing with all of the ins and outs of the immediate crisis. I think it would be very sensible to have a crack squad of well-informed public servants sitting in a room somewhere thinking about like what we should be rolling out in 6 to 12 months' time, what should be in the 2027 budget, what should be the national plan between the Commonwealth and the states and territories to improve our resilience to these sorts of shocks. Really kind of working up the thinking, looking at, the advice of, august bodies like the IEA and the various think tanks that have opined on this topic. I know Grattan has had a fair bit to say about the various, the fuel tax arrangements and the various contexts in which they play out across the economy and how they could be transitioned over time. There's no shortage of ideas, but what the nation would really benefit of is a really, well thought through and coherent strategy that looked at all of those options and actually rolled it out. I think you could do a bit of that in the coming budget, but I think it's also a pretty febrile environment. And to the degree that some of the proposals would see the tax treatment of liquid fuels change and potentially like prices go up in the short term because of some of the things that are being contemplated, it could be quite hard politically to pull that off. That might be a better thing that is kind of like either flagged or staged in the sort of the immediate aftermath of the crisis, where there's kind of like, public appetite for kind of like sorting this out once and for all. The other thing that I think should be on the table that nobody's really talking about, but if we're serious about this from an energy security, a fuel security and national security point of view, for some of these categories of vehicle for which there are more cost-effective alternatives in the form of EVs, doing what has been done in some parts of the world and actually just saying we're not going to sell them after this date. Provide that clear signal to the market because from a national security perspective, it doesn't make sense for us to be importing and selling these things to Australia where there are, more affordable, more functional, often better performing alternatives. Like, let's have that conversation, right?
And up until late February this year, we were seeing a move to soften some of those mandates and end dates overseas. And those moves which were in response to all kinds of concerns, but they look pretty, what's the opposite of prescient? Myopic now. And it does make sense to transition the emergency or critical uses that we're talking about as well. Those should be the fastest where there is an actually viable electrified alternative. And in the case of public transport, city buses have started shifting to electric, but that could go faster. There is a lot that could be done. To me, an unknown is how much people's, like individuals and business behaviour will shift as a result of shift in price signals and the memory of these events. There have been a lot of people, I think, who have believed, I have no personal insight into this dynamic at all, that the asset write-off provisions for small businesses that have been, played with by successive governments over the last 15 years or so have encouraged inadvertently or advertently people to buy a lot more great big shiny utes than their strict business needs might otherwise have supported. And if that's true, it's because a bunch of people have liked great big shiny utes. Are they still going to like that? I've found it really weird when going around the last few weeks of like incipient stage 1.5 crisis Australia to see like huge billboards out spruiking the 2026 Monstro truck Mark 2000 for all the major suppliers. It feels very dinosaurish in a way that previously it was just like, well, that's not for me because I'm an inner city latte sipper. I don't actually like coffee, but I do ride a bike. But now it just feels like that's probably not where the market is going to be at. So, you know, I think you do need policy change, but culture change may be its own thing. My only other thought is to your point, Luke, about is it plausible that governments are going to be willing to make fuel tax changes or alter deductions at a time of affordability crisis? I have previously seen, I haven't seen anybody crank this out in this crisis, but I have previously seen people try the idea of tax policy changes that only kick in as market prices start to decline, and which slow the rate of decline and ultimately limit the extent of decline, but don't add on top of crisis prices. That seems to me like a tricky bit of choreography to pull off, both in terms of the actual logistics of it and the politics of it. But a sort of a stabilisation type of regime where you cut fuel taxes as prices go up and you ratchet them up a bit, but not as fast as the rate of decline in prices, might be something to think about, but a bit of a minefield as well.
Hard to pull off. In reality, I'd say, I don't know, the whole thing is kind of fraught. It just is. The one thing you would have to think would definitely be in the offing, given, you know, the cut in fuel excess, and the IEEFA paper highlights this as well. You know, a lot of what we're broadly framing is like industry policy or things that we would want to see happen over the next little while to increase electrification across key sectors, but with a particular focus on transport, given there's more work to do there, is to increase tax on coal and gas exports. And that, I guess you just have to think that is in the offing this budget. If for no other reason that they just need the money to pay for all of the cuts in fuel excise and, you know, and other things that might be coming down the pipeline. I just feel like the temptation is a little too high there, and that the need is there too. And it makes sense, I would add.
So I fundamentally agree with that. It has never seemed more plausible to me that we do wind up with a significant tax move on gas in particular. I have received pushback on that view from people who say, with reason to know, that I am underestimating the amount of PTSD in the federal government from previous rounds of particularly rent tax ideas. There are a couple of ideas, like different genres of idea out there for what a tax move might look like. We have previously discussed the Superpower Institute's very ambitious and well fleshed out concept for a symmetrical cash flow tax of 40% on top of company tax for the oil and gas sector, which is carefully designed to be economically neutral and not discourage or encourage investment in that sector. That's not the idea that's getting the most discussion. The one that is getting the most discussion is an ACTU idea that I think in particular the Australia Institute have gotten in behind for a 25% revenue tax on gas exports specifically. This is the one, I think, that the government has asked Treasury to provide some advice on. Whether that request was of the tell us why this isn't a good idea nature or greater interest, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of hard. It's hard to have any kind of informed conversation about what the government is or isn't thinking about, right? Because this has been like a one-sentence conversation in reported media, and you'd sort of hopefully be thinking you've got to kind of articulate the policy challenge that you're solving for with something like this, despite everything I just said about this is actually just about getting a bunch of money into the budget to pay for other things, which is a reason. But I think we don't know the design of what's being considered. And so I think it is important to think about, whether there's likely to be other flow-on consequences that have price impacts, or, if there would be broader, economic benefits for households and businesses from doing something like this, then I think that needs to be considered and articulated too.
So the only thing I'd say on this proposal around getting a fair share for the Australian taxpayer from gas exports and some of the other more ambitious proposals for tax reform that are floating around the place is I did have a look at the Prime Minister's address at the National Press Club. The Prime Minister in his address was like, you know what, we've got a crisis to deal with, but the economic challenges that Australia is facing doesn't sort of mean that there is less of an imperative to, have an ambitious and reforming budget. There is more of an imperative, which I thought was pretty interesting because he could have gone down on the pathway. He could have said, look, we've got a crisis to deal with. This is the focus of the government. He could have used that address to tamp down expectations. They were going to be doing capital B, capital T, big things in the May budget, but he explicitly did not do that. So I think that's very much a watch this space.
Yep.
They are going to have some sort of story to tell about the things they're doing to set themselves up for the future prosperity of the country. And, this is, the second year of their second term, and, it's a time where they'll want to get some things out there and bed them down before they're getting too much closer to an election. So if they're ever going to go, now's the time to fuel crisis or no.
I have high hopes.
As always, we close out the show with one more thing in which we all share something that is currently captivating our attention. Tennant, what have you got?
So I want to pull the view back, way back, and just mention a thing that is going on that is quite nice, which is, as we speak, the mission underway, the second mission of the Artemis program, the return of, I guess, America specifically, but not just America. There's non-Americans on board this mission. The process of returning after 50 years to the moon. And I mention it just because it is a marvelous feat of human ingenuity, and really a massive mountain of marvelous feats that is responsible for this. Because it has provided already, as we speak, the first image in half a century of the whole Earth taken from the part-way point between the Earth and the Moon, and the original photo of that nature, the blue marble photograph, played an important role in building the late 20th century's global consciousness, including the environment movement. and because it's just really interesting. Of course, this is like everything else, a mirror into which you can see whatever you want to see. And I've seen people making remarks about the fading capabilities of America in some respects, or the surging capabilities in other respects. If I was going to impose something extra on it beyond what I've already said, it's just to think about the changes in the world that have gone on since the first US moon program. The Apollo program was spending at its peak about, well, NASA as a whole, heavily composed of the Apollo program, 4.5% of US GDP. Now, that was, at that level for just a couple of years, but it was pretty bloody big. This program is part of a current level of NASA spending that is about 0.1% of US GDP, which is a marker of both the success in reducing somewhat the costs of doing space and just how much economic growth there has been in the last 50 years. But I'm just hanging out for cool images, and by the time the pod goes to the stream waves, I guess we will know what happened. So far, looking very good, apart from some complications with the plumbing on the old space toilet.
And with that, we'll draw a veil. The mission of the good ship Artemis.
Please.
A better veil than you can draw inside a crowded tin can with 5 people in it, I reckon.
Yep. Frankie, what have you got?
Well, now this is going to sound very myopic compared to Tennant's awesome stylings. Much more closer to home for me. Being the Sydney-based podcaster of the three of us, I pay a little more attention to developments at the state government level in New South Wales. And I think my last couple of One More Things have been celebrations and anticipation of the New South Wales EPA having regulated fugitive methane from coal mines.
Oh, are we getting another Moscovich's methane musings?
Oh, like a partial methane musing.
Okay.
No, I'm going to shout out some advice that came that was released in March, so not too long ago, from the New South Wales Net Zero Commission. And they've put a pretty tidy, short, sharp paper out there, advice to government on what should inform the government's thinking for their net zero plan for 2035. So New South Wales has a target of 70% emissions reduction by 2035, and as we often talk about on this here podcast, on that time horizon, a lot more than the electricity and energy sector need to be decarbonising at scale. And so the Commission really neatly lays out what needs to happen across the New South Wales economy, and they've got kind of 4 buckets of priorities. One is like doubling down on the electricity sector transition to underpin all the electrification that needs to happen. And then they sort of talk about shrinking the non-electricity emissions across kind of key sectors. They highlight industry, transport, and the built environment, like in particular. So they go gangbusters on electrification, very relevant to the conversation that we've just been had. So they're talking about accelerating transport electrification, really kind of trying to ramp up electrification of low intensity industrial heat, and also doing a lot more on residential electrification. So I am very much back on that familiar hobby horse about
Hey.
Yes, thank you, Mental, for obliging me. But then they also highlight a focus on significantly reducing methane emissions. So looking at the agriculture sector as well as obviously the mining sector, which is a big chunk of emissions in the New South Wales economy. The priority that I particularly wanted to highlight and then just commend is that they've got an eye to the future beyond that. So they're wanting the government to think about laying foundations now for post-2035. So doing the thinking to inform like an industrial strategy for the state. So like, what are the industries of the future that the state wants to support? And, you know, that if they've got a view about that, then you can think about what policies you want to start preparing or putting in place to encourage those industries. And it also, they sort of make a point around enabling for land use planning controls from an adaptation perspective as well. Because you could also say there has been a lot of stuff built in places where it shouldn't have been built. If we're thinking about the future climate risks that are, you know, that are already kind of baked in. So I liked the clarity of the thinking in it. It's a really short paper. Anyone who's interested can go have a look. I'll link it in the show notes. But like, watch this space. The New South Wales government's putting out their net zero plan middle of the year, and there's some really good ideas in here that people should check out. Exciting times.
Exciting times. For my one more thing, I'm going to do a piece of pop culture that I partook in very recently, in fact. There is a movie of the Magic Faraway Tree that I went to see with my 12-year-old and my 8-year-old and their 11-year-old cousin this Easter weekend. And the work of Eden Blyton forms an outsized part of my literary experiences as a young child. And so I entered the theatre with a sense of trepidation. And I can say it was fine. It was good. Like they significantly fleshed out the story of the children and the family and added quite a lot of drama on that side of things. If anything, I would say that probably the magical elements, the titular faraway tree and the folk of said tree, could have had a bit more oomph and vim and verve and character development. They took up a lot of time with the family drama, but it was fun. The main complaint of my children was not enough lands. They spent a lot of time in a few lands at the top of the tree, whereas they were looking for a wider variety of beloved lands that could have been visited over the running time. But I gave it 3 out of 5 stars, and my 8-year-old gave it 3 out of 5 stars. So if you have fond memories of those books, if any of you are looking for something to do this school holidays, I give it a tick of approval. It's not going to change your life, but it will be a pleasant hour and a half at the movies with your kids.
What a benignly middling recommendation. Is it going to spawn a runaway pop culture new sensation that will finally see us get the adaptation of The Naughtiest Girl in the School series? Or has the time for that property passed?
They are weird books, The Naughtiest Girl in the School books. They are really weird.
I've never read them.
All right. We are almost done, but at the end of the show, we record a bonus episode called There Is Too Much, in which we kick back, grab a drink, and cover something we didn't have time for on the main show. Our recording of There Is Too Much is going to be time shifted. It's going to be happening in a day or two, but it will be arriving in your feeds as per usual if you are a subscriber on Saturday. But Tennant, stare into the future. What can you see through the time portal? What will be discussed and who will be discussing it?
The swirling mists part and reveal more swirling mists made of liquefied natural gas and other gases. Yes, we're going to be talking about the gas statement of opportunities In past years, the cause of enormous ructions. This year, maybe the cause of some confused sighs of relief. Why is that the case? Frankie and I will be discussing it, but maybe not discussing it will be one Luke Menzel, because this will be the first consequence for this podcast of Luke's mere deification as of the Australian Energy Market Operator, the producer of our Statement of Opportunities, and therefore subject to our no self-dealing.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll see, Luke, if you can lend a benign or
Mm-hmm.
but otherwise.
Just Frankie and you, I'm sure you'll do a great job. And yes, this is the new operating procedure. If we're talking about an email document, I will be recusing myself. But I know that you guys will do a great job, and I will confine my comments to wishing you well with your discussion of the case statement of opportunities. So if you wish to partake in that very timely discussion from my co-hosts, run, don't walk to letmesumup.net. You will find the support LMSU tab at the top of the page. You can click through to our Patreon, subscribe for the low price of $10 a month, and you too can access that sweet BOCO. That is our show for today. This podcast was edited by energy professional and podcast tragic Marcus Spencer from Here Media Studio. Frankie, you like promoting things in your role as Global Vice President of Marketing and Extortion at the Let Me Sum Up podcast. What do you wish to promote today?
I'm doubling down on energy sovereignty now. I didn't spend a couple of hours of my Saturday last week for nothing, guys.
Oh, you're back on the train of trying to sell these things now.
Just a little sting in the tail, you know. I thought about how many fevered texts passed between us over this thing. Dear listeners, you should take some heart over how much we agonize about the placement of words on the canvas of said T-shirts. So
it's true. Definitely
send us a signal that we didn't waste time of our Saturday last week. Go grab one of those T-shirts. It will make us very happy to see it out in the wild.
If you won't do it for Australia, do it for this podcast.
That's right.
Run, don't walk, as they say. For Frankie Musfitch and Tennant Reid, I'm Luke Menzel. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon.
I wish to issue a late-breaking development in the Artemis 2 mission. I can confirm I inadvertently invented a stowaway. There are 4, not 5, astronauts on that mission, rendering the toilet situation ever so slightly more manageable.